What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a look at Metaphor ReFantazio. The latest title from Atlas, the studio behind the much-loved Persona series, this time, however, bringing some of that classic formula into more traditional fantasy, let's say. Now, before we get into all that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a link below to a video going over everything I cover, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. Now, a couple other notes in the case of this game. I did receive a review copy of this, even though it released about a week and some change ago, and that is because I got that review copy on the day the game released, so I started at pretty much the same time everyone else did, and it's probably worth a mention that Metaphor here seems to be at least a little bit shorter than some of Atlas's other titles. So while the achievements for this one are fairly thorough, it's not quite as time-intensive as you might initially think to 100% this one. There are more or less chapters in the game that, as long as you put a sort of safety save at, you can easily reload and pick up anything you missed in the event that that happened, which is possible. But moving along from there, let's talk a little bit more about what Metaphor here is all about. So, as I mentioned, this game effectively uses the Persona formula, but of course mixing up the actual content therein. Now, if that doesn't mean anything to you, what I in fact mean by it is that the game takes place over a few months, and every day, outside of specific days meant for story events, your character effectively has the day and night to themselves, and you have to choose which priorities you want to have there, either speaking with companions and taking on activities to boost certain stats, or perhaps going and doing a dungeon. Now, dungeons are a little different in that they take all day, so you can't really do anything else that day after you go through a dungeon, assuming you even fully clear it in that one day. Now, you take that general framework and apply more traditional JRPG things like bounty hunts, potentially turn-based battles, exploring side quests and things to flesh out the world around you. And overall, I'd say you've got a really great entry into that genre with a couple of caveats. I do think there comes a point where the game kind of runs out of things to show you, and it can frankly start to feel very repetitious, both in terms of gameplay structure and actual activities. And I have some gripes about the late game combat that we'll get into as well. But I want to kick this video off talking about the technical state of this one. Now, speaking for myself at the very least, this game worked pretty flawlessly for me. I didn't really have any issues. I could rebind the keys I wanted to on PC. It's also not a particularly graphically demanding game, as I'm sure you can see on screen, and thus I didn't have any issues with things like FPS drops, etc. It worked about as well as I could have asked for, which is flawlessly because I am demanding. Kidding, of course, though. Looking at Steam on this subject, I have seen a few people nitpick things like anti-aliasing and little things like that, but by and large, this game seems to be running very well for people, which is certainly good. Moving on a little bit, I want to talk about difficulty. So this game has 5 difficulty levels: Storyteller, Easy, Normal, Hard, and Regicide. The 2 noteworthy ones are Storyteller and Regicide mostly, though. Regicide is only for New Game Plus, and it is the highest difficulty. You do have to beat the game first before you unlock that, which can be done on any of the previous difficulties, it doesn't matter. But Storyteller, on the other hand, once you turn that on, you cannot change it back, and mostly, from what I understand at least, is that it is the easy difficulty with the caveat that you also cannot die, because you can just choose to resurrect your characters if that happens mid-battle. Now, as for the rest of the difficulties, my understanding of what they affect here is primarily that as you move up in difficulty, enemies will get an extra action per enemy turn, and it also adjusts the scaling of damage percentages relative to level. So that's certainly something to know. Now, one thing I like about all their approaches to difficulty here is that even on the lower difficulties, you still kind of have to learn how the game works, outside of Storyteller difficulty, but even there, if you don't set your characters up for success, you're in for a real bad time. Probably also worth a mention that on Storyteller difficulty specifically, I believe that the New Game Plus Super Boss is not available, but beyond that one specific restriction, difficulty seems pretty freeform otherwise, which I would imagine is down to the fact that JRPGs and grinding go hand in hand, and it is simply possible to outlevel basically everything if you've got the time, which is as good a place as any to jump into the story setup of this title. So, this game hasn't been out very long, and it is a longer game, so I really don't want to spoil the story here for people who are still running through it, and so we're going to talk about the basic plot setup and some generalities about what I liked and didn't like. If you're not up for that, maybe skip past this part. Otherwise, let's continue on. So, the story of Metaphor revolves around the assassination of the king. This happens in the opening scene, which means naturally that a successor must be chosen. This is important because only the king of the kingdom has access to what is called the royal scepter, which channels what they call the royal magic, which is implied to be this cataclysmic level of power that no one could hope to oppose. However, on the king's death, a magical event is triggered, preventing his assassin from simply seizing the throne, because the failsafe here is that the king's death triggered a sort of magical election, let's call it. I think in my previous impressions video somebody called it democracy magic, which really made me laugh. But that is kind of the gist of it. Basically, the king is using that royal magic to establish that at the end of a few months, whoever has the most popular support amongst the people will be elected to be the new king, with a couple of caveats. There is magic protecting the top candidates from being assassinated, as an example. Now, this gets a little more complicated when we find out that the king did technically have an heir to the throne. However, that prince has been believed dead for some time, but was actually saved from death's door only to be put into a sort of magical coma by the event. Our main character is working with a group whose job is to protect that prince. And as our character arrives in the nation's capital to get to the bottom of all this, we slowly get dragged into all of these events and how they connect and interlace. And overall, I would say it's a pretty grand narrative with a weak third quarter. The story starts really strong, it's really engaging. I think it continues to be so until you get to about the middle of the game where it really starts to drag. And then right as I was thinking to myself, man, this is taking way too long, it needs to hurry up, it started barreling towards the end for what was ultimately a very strong finish as well. But there is a point there, and like I mentioned, the third quarter basically, where I think this game is likely to lose a lot of people, especially because there is a dungeon at the end of that section, which has to be the longest dungeon in the game. It is insanely long. That single bit of content was legitimately like 10% of the entire game time for my first playthrough. Not because I was struggling, just because that's how long that dungeon is. It was very annoying. But luckily, right after that dungeon wraps up is where the game starts finally moving towards its conclusion, which managed to pull me back in, and then like I said, the game has a very strong ending. Now, a couple of other notes. There is no post-game, so the end date for the game is just the end date. However, towards the end, you do also have a really wide window of time to wrap up anything you might have missed during the story, and that time frame, combined with being really efficient, ideally during the rest of the game, will leave you with more than enough time to wrap up like 90% of stuff outside of a couple things that are missable, which is where your safety saves at the beginning of each chapter come in. But as I just mentioned with that phrase, the entire story is told through timers. And while initially I found this a little bit off-putting, truth be told, while I was actually playing through the game, I came to appreciate it because it does have a way of sort of forcing the plot to move on. But even still, in things like dungeons, etc., you're free to run around as much as you want. You can take as much time as you please there. So it has like a really soft timing system, which I came to appreciate over the course of playing it, mostly though because it is actually a really forgiving system. You've got a lot of time to get things done as long as you are not, just doing a terrible job. You should be okay. Now, just for the sake of the people wondering, I'm sure playtimes seem to vary wildly on this. I see a lot of people talking about like 60 to 80. I personally ran through it in about 40 for my first run of the game, and I was also able to find some people who cleared it in about that time, like 40 to 45 hours. And if I had to guess, this likely comes down to just how much grinding you're doing and for how long, that type of thing, which is to tell you there's a really, really wide range of playtimes there. But even at the higher ends, it does seem to be shorter than some of their previous work at the very least. Moving on though, let's finally talk a bit about progression systems, and there's a fair few of them. The most basic one simply being your character's level. As you complete quests and fight enemies, you're going to be gaining experience, and that levels your characters up. For all of your party members, this comes with set stat increases. For your character, however, one will be set, and then you'll get a second point that you can allocate to any of the stats you wish, kind of choosing how you want to upgrade them. With that in mind, there are items throughout the game you can find that will adjust these stats further further and permanently, meaning it is possible to upgrade them beyond just this. Another big part of progression is naturally all of our gear. This game does have a fun gearing system for a JRPG. Now, there are very clear upgrades in a lot of cases, but oftentimes within a certain tier of gear for a particular part of game, you have some options, things that will prioritize, say, evasion or resistance or outright immunity to certain types of attacks, which is important for preparing for certain boss battles and the like, as preparation, thanks to the timers of the game, does play a big role in the larger encounters for sure. Another neat little side system to the gear, though, is that occasionally you can find items that need to be purified at the church, which can be taken to a church, of course, and then upgraded in some way, and some of those items even have multiple progression routes where you can choose between what it is you want to prioritize on that item, which I thought was a really cool system. There are also igniters. These are effectively accessories that you can equip to your character that often provide abilities of some sort or just outright stat increases if you don't want to bother with that. And the reason they relegate that to accessories is because of the archetype progression system. At a certain point in the story, our character taps into the power of their own blood, so to speak, rips out a mechanical heart, and embodies an archetype. These are where our primary skills and stat increases beyond level are going to come from. Basically, every character can have an archetype equipped. The archetype has a rank associated that will level up as you level up as well, though independently of you, mind you, and these ranks go to 20. After that, you achieve mastery and get permanent upgrades to your character as well, but any skills your archetype unlocks as they rank up can then be inherited by other archetypes, meaning that there is a lot of benefit to simply spreading around which ones you're learning. Now, a system I really liked here that made this a lot faster in terms of learning the many archetypes that there are is that once you master an archetype and you continue to use it, every time it ranks up after that, you get an item that just gives you experience to apply to your other archetypes as well, so you can level those up without actually changing the one you enjoy, which was great. Worth a mention, though, that archetypes are per character. Your character will start influencing their companions, which get access to archetypes as well. And in fact, your companions and other people you'll meet along the journey embody different archetypes, and that's how you're going to learn them. But once you've got them unlocked, everybody who meets the requirements can in fact learn them and thus equip them. Which leads us right into our next progression system, which is bonds. So the characters you meet, companions included, but also just other characters along your journey that embody those archetypes, have a bond with your character. This is how you're going to get access to the better versions of those archetypes they embody, as each one of these characters is associated with a sort of lineage, the game calls it, of archetypes. But you'll also, from increasing these bonds, get a bunch of extra benefits from doing so as well, such as upgrades to shop inventories, discounts at merchants, convenience features like being able to study archetypes right from the main menu instead of having to travel to a little personalized world place to do it. So there's a lot of great reasons to be increasing those bonds. Now, doing this usually costs you either a day or night period, and over the course of the game they become more and more available. But the gist of it is spend time and pay attention to all of the people you meet along your journey, and you will be rewarded thusly. If you are being efficient, you will have more than enough time to easily max all of these out, which will give you access to all the archetypes, which can then be all maxed out themselves to give your characters huge passive boosts to their power. And then last but not least, we have virtues. You see, some of those bonds, and just some side quests actually, can only be obtained if you have the required level of virtue. There are a bunch of aspects to being king that represent your readiness to do so, basically, and a lot of the activities in the game will increase these virtues up to a maximum of 5 per one. And a lot of that side content and the like requires some level of these virtues to be initiated. And the game will make it very clear like what virtue you need for what activity, so it's not hidden or anything, but you definitely need to know about it. From there though, let's talk about the gameplay and world section. Starting of course with the structure of the title, which I've already mentioned up to this point, but basically days are passing. We are subject to a soft timer here where during the day we can do an activity and during the night we can do an activity, or we can do a dungeon which takes the whole day. Later on you'll get access to a gauntlet runner which is going to allow you to travel the realm, and while you are on the gauntlet runner there's also other separate activities you can do only there, as you make your way to things like dungeons and whatnot, which can itself sometimes take a few days, which requires a little bit of planning on the player's end. Now, some days are effectively deadlines that you are required to have completed the main story objective by that date, at which point the story sort of forcibly starts to move you forward. However, if you are efficient, the game gives you more than enough time to get everything done. But even still, I would recommend making a separate save file at the start of each main story section where you start working towards that deadline. But this is the part at which I think the game gets a little bit repetitive, because this is the structure for the entire game. It's basically plot stuff happens, have a couple of weeks to yourself where you can choose your activities, get everything worked out, complete main story objective, bunch of plot happens, you move on to the next act, on repeat. Which definitely gets a little bit repetitive, and I think it's the reason the game sort of falters towards the tail end before it starts to wrap up. Because ultimately, the game has very little new to show you after a certain point, and while the main story dungeons can be a little bit unique in terms of mechanics and things you have to watch out for, all of the side dungeons, etc. are very simple and not subject to that, let's say, difference in gameplay, with the bulk of them just seeing you run through, smack enemies around, especially once you get to a level where you can just beat them in the action mode and not even enter tactical combat, and once you get to a point in the game where you can much easily recover your MP, which is likely to be a limiting factor in the early game. MP is going to power your archetype skills and everything they can combine to deal damage to enemies. Early game, you don't have a lot of options for MP recovery. There's a couple. If you have the mage archetype, for instance, you can get a little bit back here and there, but it's likely going to be a problem. Now, I would say by the second to third chapter of the title, you'll likely be over this and be able to easily do entire dungeons in a single go without having to worry about it. It is a problem towards the start at the very least, because even the methods you have at that time are frankly very slow. Now, that's not to say it's all bad. I do think some of the dungeons were really, really unique, like this one that takes place inside a monster, and as such has some unique mechanics you have to engage with. You're even on a little bit of a timer, and I genuinely thought that was probably the coolest dungeon in the entire game. But there is more to the gameplay and world here, and that is mostly the world they've built. I would be remiss not to mention some of this, because they've crafted an interesting piece of media here, let's call it, because the crux of the world here is that our world is a fantasy to them. It quite literally takes the form of a fantasy novel carried around by the protagonist, where he talks about some things that are a common enough place in our own world, though I would certainly not say universal by any stretch. And as such, they call the big devastating monsters that are becoming more and more of a problem across the realm humans, which I thought was kind of humorous, and I would go so far as to say the entire thing might be some sort of metaphor, but I'll leave that to the highbrow gaming journalists. A reason this particular world might not necessarily be considered so great a place, and why they look to our world as fantasy, is because despite the democracy magic and the magic in general and everything else the game has going on, it really has a sort of tribal caste system where each race in this fantasy world is what they call a tribe, and a lot of these tribes, as you might imagine, don't get along. In fact, basically, if you're not one of the accepted tribes, your life is pretty terrible. This includes things like the bat-like Ujif, our main character's tribe, Elda, who looks suspiciously human. Maybe that's a plot point. But those characters have a rough go of it. Now, more accepted tribes, like the Clamar, the ones with the horns, or the elves with a tribe name I can't pronounce, really don't have much of a challenge at all. But even here, take, say, the elven ones. These guys are effectively seen as warriors and nothing else, and anytime they try to do anything else, it's pretty unwelcome. So even if you're one of those accepted tribes, you're sort of forced into that box by their society here. Now, this is one of those things where I see where the game is going with it, but I, obviously realize this stuff still happens in our world that they're purporting to be fantasy in this one, but, again, metaphors. Which brings us to the combat system. So, combat in this game is a mix of action and tactical turn-based that you would expect from a JRPG. Now, the action system is very simple. I don't want to overinflate it, but basically, outside of proper turn-based combat, you will be able to attack enemies and potentially kill them in basically one hit, sometimes two, if you are significantly stronger than them. This is done by color coding, but also you can sort of see it on the game's mini-map. If an enemy is not highlighted with a red icon on the minimap, you should be able to kill them without entering tactical turn-based mode. This is important because you still get experience and loot and everything from that without having to spend any MP or take any risk. Even if those lower level enemies hit you, it still won't initiate combat, whereas anything above a certain level or on par with your character can hit you to initiate combat, which will see you ambushed. Now, if you can hit the enemy enough times, you can fill up their stun meter and effectively ambush them to start the game on the right foot. And combined with some late game abilities that actually also open up combat with a potential big devastating hit on the enemy, you can wipe enemies out in the first turn that way. So it's important to try not to get hit in this action system, even if you're fighting an enemy that you actually are on level for. Now, at any moment, you can hit what is the V key by default to just jump straight into tactical turn-based mode if you want to do that for some reason. Now, this action side of things is both a big quality of life thing and also a huge time saver for grinding, because you can still level up, master archetypes, etc. as you do that, which is really the best use case for it. You can just really power level your way through things. If you focus on the enemies you can kill super fast that way at zero risk to yourself. And they will respawn after a little while, which brings me to the turn-based tactical side of things. Now, this is sort of team-based, but the game uses turn icons. Those crystals up at the top of the screen are the icons that you can use to take actions with characters on your turn. Most actions will take a single action icon. Some big abilities will use 2, and doing things like using an item or passing your turn will use a half of an icon. Now that's important because that's not the only part. You see, if you hit an enemy's weak spot, you'll actually gain a turn icon, which I believe is an extra icon per character that hits a weak point. I don't think you can double up on them. And then much later on, at least one of your archetypes anyway, gets an ability that will just give you extra turn icons at least once per battle. Now the catch here is that if you miss, you effectively lose an extra turn icon. So the icon you spent on the attack plus one more is what you get if you miss. That's important because a lot of enemies, especially in the late game, will buff things like their evasion and make themselves harder to hit. So understanding that icon system is really integral to victory, and that's before you start looking at the mechanics of late game bosses. But let's talk about some of the other aspects of this. Now, your archetype plays a huge role in this, and not just yours. You and your companions or fellow party members archetypes as well, because this defines not only the skills they can use in combat, but also the synthesis options. These are effectively archetype combos where you can use you and a party member's archetype to perform some special attack, usually a very, very strong one. And then there's things like positioning, guarding, and doing what you can to avoid incoming damage. So you can move to the back row or front row pretty freely, and this of course affects attack and damage taken, and then you can also guard, which resists damage taken as well. So if an enemy's doing a big wind-up charge attack that you can't do anything to break, you'll want to of course fall back and guard so you take as little damage from it as possible. Other things you have to deal with later on though are enemies who can be just like immune to a certain damage type or even potentially repel it back to you, which is where the sort of research comes in. So oftentimes for things like bounties and big boss battles, you'll be able to go to informants in town and gather information on this and other stuff as well, mind you, where they will basically tell you what this enemy is weak to and kind of what their general gist is so you can plan accordingly. For instance, there are monsters in the game that hate certain archetypes and will be enraged by their presence in battle, making that more difficult, as you might imagine. So while it is a standard, like sort of turn-based JRPG system, there is a fair bit to it. Now, if all of that sounds too tedious for you, you can in fact just turn on auto battle mode. I know I certainly did for quite a few battles, as it gets a little tedious after a while, so you might as well just let it play out on its own. And then the auto battle as well has a bunch of different tactics modes you can choose from, which is helpful in customizing that. So often what I would do is simply use the auto battler and then jump in when it was clearly struggling with something after a certain point. But the last thing I want to leave the combat section on is just some of the late game boss fights. So I just talked about that turn icon thing. You might be wondering how that works for a single enemy boss fight. Well, typically these big bosses will still get like several turn icons so they can take several actions in a single turn, as you might expect, as you otherwise would simply just destroy them via the action economy. And that's the whole point of this icon system, is to balance that out. Now, not all, but some of the late game bosses are extremely annoying because what they do is get a free abuse power system for this turn icon system. Oftentimes, this is an ability called Soul Scream. It will occasionally take other forms, but that is the primary one. And enemies who use Soul Scream, which they can do once per turn as opposed to your once per battle, just gain free turn icons. And some fights, this is kind of whatever, it just kind of balances it out. But some late game bosses will have like, say, 7-8 actions and then use Soul Scream and gain 4 more. And then they literally spend 10-11 attacks in a row spamming you with group AoEs. And while that doesn't feel great by itself, it gets a little worse because on your turn, chances are you're on the back foot. You're going to have to spend probably 1 or 2 of your own actions simply recovering from the hits you just took. And then you might get a couple of attacks before it switches right back to the enemy and they do the same thing again. And there's a few ways around this, debuffing them for starters, so they're doing minimal damage to you, but also decreasing their hit rate ideally, so hopefully they miss and burn up turn icons without actually doing anything to you is super helpful. And then of course, party-wide restorative items that can just completely sort out your team in like a single use are extremely helpful just so you don't get annihilated in just sheer action economy. Now, thankfully, almost all of what I just mentioned there is relegated to optional in-game bosses. They are not required for anything, which is why I'm willing to give it a pass overall, but I really have to say I did not enjoy a lot of those fights because that is the primary tactic that all of them use. And speaking for myself, that just wasn't fun. But luckily, again, in-game optional stuff, and most of the ones that are required that also use that mechanic are much easier and don't get as many actions as the late game ones do. Which finally brings me to Steam Deck performance. So you can play this on the Steam Deck, as the graphics might imply. It's not exactly a demanding title. However, there's a couple things to know. Officially, it has a rating of playable, and this is because the text on screen is very small. As you can see probably in the menus you've seen on screen, there's a lot of information being thrown at you there, and on the Steam Deck, that is very, very small writing. The other thing, though, is that you're likely going to have to configure the graphics in order to get a solid frame rate, which might come as a surprise when you look at how this game looks. And given the fact that the minimum specs for this are well under what the Steam Deck has, nonetheless, you're going to have to adjust some things. Turning ambient occlusion off seems to do wonders for your frame rate on the Steam Deck, just to give a specific thing you can change. But you're likely going to have to mess around with the graphics settings to get a solid FPS there. But otherwise, it should be an enjoyable experience. Controller support, cloud saves, the works. Turn-based games in general do really well on that system. So I think this is a great game to play on the Steam Deck. Just remember those things if that's what you want to do. Which brings me to my positives and negatives before we wrap this thing up. So on the positive side of things, I thought the grand narrative was really cool. I think the game starts off really, really strong, and while it does have that weak portion, I also think the game ends in a really great manner. It's also really cool to build bonds with these people all along your journey, some of which were genuinely moving to me, and if I give this game credit for anything else, let it be that it made me feel a feeling. But genuinely, the story and the themes and the world they've built here are really cool, and I think they're worth exploring. I also think a lot of their combat system is really fun, discounting those late game bosses. I enjoy the quality of life that this allows for, where you can start in that action system and then even use that entirely to grind up levels and everything to save yourself a bunch of time, while still also engaging in a sort of core JRPG mechanic at this point. And most of the time, even the turn-based tactical battles feel really great. I was a little worried about how that would look in the higher levels, but again, outside of those late game bosses, which is where I'm going to start my negatives at, it is a pretty great system. But those late game bosses do exist. They're very annoying, but thankfully they're pretty much entirely optional. So unless you just really want to do them, you don't have to. So I'm not going to ding the game too hard for it, but I did find them extremely annoying and I wanted to mention it. Now, the other negative for me though was just the repetition. Frankly, the game runs out of new things to show you relatively quickly, and at that point there's a very clear pattern the game takes, not just in its day-night cycle, but also just game structure, because the game can can effectively be broken down into chapters where you have to do thing by deadline, then a bunch of story happens, and then you have to do thing by deadline again. And while more often than not, there's interesting enough stuff going on in there to make that okay for a while, there does come that point in the middle where it gets old, and I think that's the weakest part of the game, which is why it's in the negative section. I wouldn't write off the entire game over it, but it is definitely a sore spot. Which brings me to my conclusion for this one. So Metaphor ReFantazio is a bit on the expensive side. The base game is $70 US and whatever that is for you regionally. And while I don't love that price, I do think it actually manages to justify that price tag if you really enjoy JRPGs especially. I think this one is fantastic in that regard, outside of a few minor quibbles. And ultimately, that's why it gets a buy out of me, which is where we are going to wrap up this particular video. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. By all means, let me know how you feel about Metaphor ReFantazio down in the comment section below. Curious to know what everybody else thinks, as always, which naturally means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.